Good evening. My name is Shayna Hertzfeld, and I'm a student co-supervisor and project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Department of French and Francophone Studies and the Center for Global Study and Engagement, I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's lecture, What Does It Mean to Be a Human Translator in the Age of AI? This event is part of the 40th anniversary celebration for our Dickinson in France program. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the event of an emergency, accessible exits are located through the door behind me. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. During the question and answer session, we ask that you keep your questions succinct so that everyone who wishes has a chance to ask their question. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that live with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. I am a history major here at Dickinson, but I have often joked that if we had a linguistics major, I might have taken a different academic path. That is why I'm so excited to introduce this event discussing the complicated linguistic process of translation and the ways in which it interacts with artificial intelligence. After having traveled to Toulouse to participate in the Dickinson in France program, I know firsthand that going between languages is anything but straightforward. Part of our class at the Dickinson Center was focused on translating an article between English and French. From this assignment, the French classes that I have taken at Dickinson, and my experience living in France, I know how helpful programs like online dictionaries and how harmful programs like Google Translate can be to the language learning process. Tonight, we have the opportunity to learn from Dr. Amélie Josselin-Leray about a potential path forward for how these types of technologies and human translators can coexist. Dr. Amélie Josselin-Leray is a professor of linguistics and translation studies at the University of Toulouse, Jean Jaurès, France, where she currently is the head of the Translation and Interpreting Department and has previously taught English. Dr. Josselin-Leray is in charge of the Master's Program in Translation Studies, which is part of the European Masters in Translation Network. She has worked as a lexicographer and reviser for the Canadian Bilingual French-English Dictionary Project at the University of Ottawa, and later completed her PhD in translation and multilingual lexicology and terminology at the University Lyon II, France. Her current studies, under the umbrella of the French National Center for Research, focuses mainly on lexicography, terminology, and corpus linguistics. Josselin-Leray's research interests have recently shifted to the use of dictionaries, term banks, and translation technologies, to the study of crowdsourced and collaborative dictionaries, and of digital lexical resources for French Sign Language. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Amélie Josselin-Leray.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. So first I'd like to say that I feel very honored and privileged to be here tonight. And I want to thank the Clark Forum for inviting me, and also Lucille Duperron from the French department here in Dickinson. I'm also glad to be back in Carlisle because I was here 11 years ago. I spent one semester here as a visiting professor teaching in the French department. So I'm very happy to be back. All right, so today I'm going to, well, I've divided my presentation into 4 parts, and I hope I won't talk too much. So you have to stop me if I do talk too much. But first, I'd like to begin by setting the scene. So, first, you may think that my presentation will be about commenting this statement or giving an answer to the question, will human translators and interpreters soon be replaced by machines? So that's what you might have thought when coming here to the presentation. Unfortunately, that's not what my presentation will be about exactly. I'm most likely going to qualify that statement. So I wouldn't say that it's right or it's wrong, but that it depends. And most importantly, what my presentation will be the point that my presentation will be trying to make is that in the age of AI, we need to train even more highly skilled and adaptable translators and language experts than before. That's my main point today. Right, so as you know, this is AI and translation is something that has been debated and that is being debated, and there are actually heated debates about it. So I thought that to start with, it was interesting to confront various points of view. So first, if we think about what we see in the press, in particular, if we think about the point of view that we can see in the press, I've taken the headlines from two European newspapers. So one is French, and basically the headline translates as the profession of the translation profession is becoming obsolete. Because of IA, and the other one, as you can read, is from The Guardian, so a British newspaper, and it says that generative AI proves a major threat to the work of translators. So that's generally the idea that you find in newspapers, magazines, that's the idea. And I also found interesting to ask ChatGPT to generate an image of AI as a very threatening animal, and that's the result you can see here in the middle. Very convincing. Now, what about the point of view of professional associations? Here you can see that the point of view are more balanced. So here there are two sides on that slide. So on the right-hand side, you have the point of view of literary translators. So these are standpoints and opinion pieces that were produced by French literary translators and their association, where, again, if you have a look at what's written in French, you can find the words that I underlined, again, show that they feel threatened, right? That they have to fight against AI and that it is a threat and that they demand a number of things. That's what you can see on the right-hand side. Now, on the left-hand side, I chose one opinion piece in particular, one standpoint, which is the one that was published last October, so it's quite recent, by the Canadian Association, one of the Canadian Association of Translators, the Auditorium, that's in Quebec. And what it says here is quite different, right? It's quite different, and it says in particular that IA has been used by translators for quite a while, and especially since 2016, and that now it's not something new, that it's been in their workflow for quite a while, and that basically translators need to adapt to it. So it's different, and the Auditorium members of the Auditorium are people who work more on what we call pragmatic translation. So that's the translation, for instance, of technical texts. So among the translation profession, you can see that the opinions are divided. Now, if we move on to academics and the academics' point of view, because academics also have something to say about AI and translation, and in particular, people like me who train future translators, here you have the opposite point of view, and what we think, most of the academics think, academics who train translators, is that no, AI won't replace translators, and AI won't replace interpreters, But what we have to do is actually to train differently. That's the main idea. And that's what I'm going to try and show tonight. In any case, there's one idea that's shared by everyone. So depending where, which side you're on, it's that there's a necessity, a strong necessity for what we call a human in the loop. So that's what you find, for instance, also in the Financial Times. So it was an article that was published last December, and especially about literary translation. And here it says that, for instance, fiction really does require that human touch. So I'm quoting from the newspaper. And I'm also talking about sign language because, as you mentioned, I also train sign language interpreters, and AI is more and more developed for sign language. But for instance, Association of Deaf People and Interpreters are also concerned about the fact that, of course, you can develop AI, but still, for instance, you have to have deaf people involved. And especially if you have avatars for AI, they have to be based on deaf people signing and not interpreters, for instance. That's one of their points of view. So, in any case, to conclude on that first part, as I said, so there's a heated debate around AI and translation. But what we have to bear in mind is that translation technology is essential for translation students, practicing translators, for those who work for companies and that are part of the language services industry. But because of machine translation, people have have begun to feel that they might be a threat. So in some cases, some people think that it's a technology that is going to make work better, more productive, and to enable immediate translation in low-stake situations, but I'm really, insisting on low-stake situations. While from others, it's a technology that it is to be feared, and because it produces unreliable output and it threatens livelihoods. And because of the advent of generative AI, the debate has been really polarized. So though the positions have been polarized, as I've tried to show just before. So this is a quotation from that book, Automating Translation, which was just published at the beginning of this year by people in Dublin City University who work on machine translation. So that was opinions, right? Points of view, opinions about AI and translation. Now what about facts? So what about facts? Well, first, there's no denying, so this is taken from a French research paper, that's why it's written in French. But this graph shows the evolution of the quality of machine translation. And as you can see, I think it's pretty clear on the graph, that the quality of machine translation has been improving. And it has been really improving since the advent of neural machine translation, so that's in yellow here on the graph. So there's no denying that the quality of translation produced through AI is much better. Now, about some other facts. So I had a look at the results of a survey. It's a yearly survey that is produced by the European language industry. And it shows that, undeniably, there's been a widespread disruption in the language industry because of the advent of, well, first of neural machine translation, but in particular generative AI, and that there is a downward trend in the market. This has been, and so the activity is stagnating. So the results were just published last month, so this is like very recent. And 77% of the participants in that survey believe that the decline in activity is caused by the adoption of a language technology. But at the same time, so language companies report a drop in profitability, but this perceived drop is not confirmed by the reported gross margins. And what the survey also shows is that language departments, university staff, and students do not share the language providers' pessimism regarding the global market. And they still expect, there's quite a number of them who expect the market to grow. Right, so I've been using the terms translation and AI, but now I would like to be a little bit more precise, and I would like to give you more explanations about what we're talking about when we're talking about translation and AI. So, and especially I've been using the term machine translation. So what do we mean when we talk about machine translation? So machine translation is any kind of tool that automatically translates from one language to another, i.e. that's a computer program that actually performs translation, but not a tool that helps during the translation process, such as online dictionaries. You mentioned online dictionaries. Online dictionaries are electronic tools, but they are not machine translation tools. Term banks, they're being used by translators, but they are not machine translation. So examples of machine translation engines are Google Translate, DeepL, and DeepL Pro, ChatGPT, for instance, or Azure. So I just mentioned a few, and there's a screenshot of DeepL, right? So basically, you enter the text that you want to translate in one window, and in another window, you get the translation, the output by the machine. So another thing that I would like to define more precisely, when we talk about AI, I would like to say a few words about the scope of AI. So we have to make a distinction between engines that rely on neural machine translation, and those have been around since 2016. So for instance, so that's what you see in the square at the top. These rely on machine learning and deep learning. And so they've been around since 2016. And that's DeepL, Google Translate, and Reverso, the most famous ones, the most popular ones. Now, what the hype is about, I would say, is generative AI. And we do have generative AI engines with translation features. But it's not only translation, whereas the first ones that I just mentioned are only translation, and they only focus on translation. So, for instance, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and the French one, Mistral, I put it in brackets because it doesn't do as well for translation, just a little bit. So that was for machine translation and AI. Now, I'm going to talk about translation and about the job of a translator, right? So what does a translator's job consist in? So if you go back to the very simplest definition of the job of a translator is, as a human being, to translate a text from one language to another, right? So that's what translators do. So translators have to do with writing, interpreters have to do with the oral translation of a text. I didn't make the distinction before precisely, but just as a reminder, this is taken from the American Translators Association website. So I've given a definition of machine translation, and I've told you what the job of a translator is. So there is a very simple equation. Well, machines will replace human beings because they're supposed to do the same job, right? They're just supposed to translate one text to another, except that it's done automatically instead of being done by a human being. But as I said, this was a very simple and a very basic definition of translation. But actually, translation is much, 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 much more complex than that. So translation is a very complex task which requires cognitive skills and which has meaning at the core. And the thing is, machines, well, I'll say more about this, but machines still can't really deal with meaning. They can do a number of things quite well, but they cannot really deal with meaning, right? So, again, you see the same two pictures taken from the American Translators Association website, but there's more, not just the pictures, right? So I'm just going to actually read from the website. So here what it says. So translators work with the written word, blah, 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 converting text from a source language into a target language. This is far more than replacing one word with another. The translator must also convey the style, tone, and intent of the text while taking into account differences of culture and dialect. Often, the finished document should read as if it had originally been written in the target language for the target audience. But this is not always the case. Highly specialized content may require the translator to retain elements of the source language culture in the target language translation. A professional translator will have the expertise to know the best approach to translation. And I think that was pretty clear yesterday. There was a workshop, because there was the AI symposium, and so I had a presentation for a workshop, and we saw examples of this. In particular, we talked about the translation of a recipe, for instance, and we saw some of this because of the cultural elements, which cultural elements you should retain, which you should translate, and none of the engines we looked at did the job completely right. Some did better than others, but there was none that did the job completely right. Another thing that I would like to insist on is the fact that translation is actually a highly technologized profession already. And it's been a highly technologized profession for quite a while. So this is taken from, this is a graph that was adapted from a very famous book on machine translation that was published in the 1990s by Hutchins and Summers, and this was adapted by a colleague at DCU that I'm quoting here in Dublin. So if you think about the job that translators do today in the digital age, you can see that there are two extremes, right? So on the right-hand side, you can see that the human beings are really involved, and that's when the human involvement is, at the top, I would say. So that's when you have what we call unaided translation, where in the translation process, the translator doesn't get help from any tool. And at the far end, you have automatic translation, where the translation process is completely performed by the machine. And in the middle, you have what we call computer-aided translation, where the translators get help from a number of tools, electronic tools, and I'll show you the difference. The thing is now, even for automatic translation, what is missing here is that there might be another step where the human will also work on what has been produced by the machine, and this is called post-editing, and I will say more a bit later on. So just to prove my point about the fact that the profession has been technologized for a long time, and I'll show you a number of things. So for instance, this is the translation workflow at the European Commission. Right, so as you know, as you may know, do you know actually how many languages are spoken within the European Commission, and how many languages are represented? Do you have any idea, by any chance? It's 24, right? So there are 24 languages, which means you know that for the countries which belong to the European Commission, for instance, all the legislative texts have to be translated into all languages. And whenever there's a European citizen which wants to be in touch, with deputies or representatives, she has the right to write in his own language and to get an answer in his own language, which means that translators have a lot of work to do at DGT, right? So that's the translation workflow at DGT, so I'm not going to comment on everything, but just to give you an idea, it's a very long and complex process, and almost at every stage of the process, there's technology involved. So for instance, for project management, because as I said, the tasks are huge, so project management. Another thing you see on the right, within the circle, it says Euramis, is what we call translation memories. I'll say more about this later. But Euramis, so that's a tool. Then later on you have term banks, and there's one term bank which is widely popular and very much used at the European Commission, which is called IATE, where you have, so it's a large bank of very specialized terms and their translations, definitions in all the 24 languages that I've mentioned. And then there are computer-assisted tools. That's what you get at the back. And then you go back to the very beginning. And poetry has to do with project management. So anyway, just to give you an idea, so if you work within an institution, there's technology almost everywhere, right? Now, another example, when you translate, for instance, you can translate what's going on in a movie, and that's called subtitling. And subtitling is done by translators, right? So this is a screenshot of a subtitler's workstation. So you'll see here that, again, to be able to do subtitling, you have to be involved in technologies. You'll see that there is, because you have to deal with the pictures, you have to deal with the audio, you have to deal with the subtitles, you have to deal with the duration, the number of characters, etc. Right? So this is a widely used subtitling software, which is called Easy Titles. Another example here, I just mentioned CAT tools, so computer-assisted translation tools, and I would say the most popular one is called SDL Trados. So this, again, is a screenshot from Trados, and most, I would say 90% maybe, of people who do pragmatic translation use these kind of tools. And they've been using them since the 1980s. I will tell you more about this too. So here in that case, on the left-hand side, you have the source text, so the text to be translated. And on the right-hand side, you have the target text, so the translation of the text. And here in the middle, there's a column in the middle, and you probably cannot see, but it says AT for automatic translation. So originally, those CAT tools rely on what we call translation memories. So translation memories is the idea that while you've been translating for a while, and you've been translating texts that are probably similar to the one you need to translate now, why not reuse the translations you've been doing before? So this kind of software tells you whether the degree of similarity between the text you have to translate and the text you've been translated before, and it shows you, oh, well, this paragraph you already translated 2 years ago. Here is what you translated, and then it gives you the choice to use the very same translation or to edit it. And so that was widely used until the year 2015. I would say it's still used, but now there's a new feature. So these tools do not actually translate. They're not machine translation, right? But now they've added machine translation features within these software, and that's what you can see here in the middle. So you have a choice between using your translation memory or using what the output produced by machine translation. And so this is what translators deal with on a daily basis. And now, if you have a look at the latest versions of some tools, so this is a screenshot from a very popular Canadian translation tool, which is called Terminotix. And you can see here, so this is a screenshot that actually dates back to November 2023. So since then, it might have evolved even more, but I haven't been using it since then. You can see that now it also features things from generative AI. So here on the right-hand side, you probably can't read, but I'm just going to tell you what's written there. The tool actually provides proposals from various NMT engines. So you have, for instance, so NMT for English to French, Sistran, I don't know how to say it in English, Sistran, DeepL, Alexa, Traduit, Modern MT, which is another engine which is based on NMT, and then Microsoft Translator. So you have six proposals from these engines, and then the translator can choose among those proposals, or can choose not to use any of the proposals, right? And what's new is what you have at the bottom that says AI. Right? So now there are also proposals from ChatGPT and OpenAI. And that was, as I said, November 2023. So it might have evolved since then. So that's what a modern-day translator would be using on a daily basis. So the introduction of generative AI is not such a revolution for translators. That's what I'm trying to show you, right? So, a translator cannot do without translation technologies. So this is the cover of a book that was published by Lynn Bowker, who's a professor of translation studies. She used to be at the University of Ottawa for a very long time, and now she's at the Université Laval, still in Canada. But she's like the expert on translation technologies. She produced that book in the 1990s, all right? And so this was a computer-aided translation technology, and at the very end of the book, there's a chapter on machine translation, right? So machine translation is not something new. So when we talk about translation technology for translation, in its broadest sense, it includes word processors, because knowing how to deal with word processing is part of the skills that a translator needs to have. Spelling checkers, spell checkers, grammar checkers, the internet, corpus compilation and corpus analysis tools. And when I say corpus, I mean it in a linguistic sense, right? So it corresponds to a very precise definition as a collection of texts which have been very clearly identified for a given purpose, etc. It's not any kind of text. Terminology management tools, translation memory tools, as I said, translation management systems, and machine translation. So that's the definition. So word processing, that was in 1980s, 1990s. The CAT tools that I just mentioned, as I said, so it started with translators and researchers, and I insist on that too, because I think that researchers also have a role to play. So it was Melby in particular in 1992 who suggested to create a translation editing interface, which would rely on the reuse of existing translations, as I mentioned before. And at the same time, they were trying to develop terminology management tools. Because the thing is, if you're dealing with a highly specialized text, you have glossaries, right? You have lots and lots and lots of very complex words that are specific to your field. So you need to manage the terminology. And in some cases, on just one page, you can have 30 specialized terms. So when you're a translator and you specialize in a field, you have to deal with all these terms. So in 1992, translation memories were integrated into CAT tools such as Trados that I just mentioned, and I showed you a screenshot. So the two main advantages were to, as I said, reuse existing translations and to produce coherent translations, because you need your terminology to be coherent. Imagine you're translating a very specialized document which is 200 pages long. You want to make sure that when you're dealing with very specialized concept, you always use the same term to refer to that concept. So that's why you have to be very precise regarding terminology. And another example of those CAT tools is the translation memory tool that they use at DGT that I mentioned before, Euramis, which is huge, like super huge. And again, they translate hundreds of millions of words at DGT every day. And again, you want to reuse those translations, especially if you're dealing with that specific area, that specific law, agriculture, the environment. You're not going to reinvent and do the job again. So they have this huge translation memory that they rely on. And this translation memory at the time when it was created was just used as a translation memory, and now it is part of the data that is being fed into the machine translation system that they use at DGT, which is one of the reasons why this engine works particularly well for DGT, because it's been trained on their own data. Then we move on to other types of tools, so corpus linguistics tools, as I've mentioned, such as concordancers. So I don't know if you've heard about concordancers, but these are the tools that you use. So a corpus, as I said, is a huge collection of texts or documents that are in electronic format and that have been chosen for a given purpose. So, for instance, I don't know, let's say you want to translate a text about because I've been working on this with my students. So, you want to translate a report on the effect on the environment of the cocoa industry. Well, you want to deal with the terminology, and you want to know how people write about this topic. So what you can do is actually gather huge amounts of texts on that topic, and then you want to extract information from that corpus. So you want to count words, you want to count frequencies, you want to identify patterns, you want to know how the words are used, how the expressions are used, and to do that, you need authentic data. So you build those huge corpora, and then you extract information from those corpora, and you do that thanks to concordancers and terminology extracting tools. And the ones that are really popular, you might have heard about Sketch Engine, because Sketch Engine is a tool that is widely used. It used to be restricted to linguists, lexicographers, people who compile dictionaries, but now everyone can use it, and also translators. And it's become very simple. I'm old now, so when I first started working on corpus linguistics, about maybe 30 years ago, accessing those corpora was quite difficult. You had to, type in lines of commands that were very long, and it was very complicated. Now you just type in your request, and you get all the information you need within a second, I would say. So translators also use this now, and now, the new thing is machine translation, and there are several systems of machine translation, as I mentioned. And I'm going to say a bit more after that. So rule-based machine translation, that was the first system for machine translation. Statistical machine translation, which was mostly used until 2016. And now there's generative AI and LLMs. Right, so to go back to machine translation. In fact, machine translation has been around for a while, but under the radar. So people have the feeling, people who don't know about translation have the feeling that this is all new, but to translators, this is not new, actually. So machine translation has a long history, and it started after the Second World War. And you also have to think about the context in which he was born, and the US actually played a great role in this. I don't know, I'm probably aware of this. So, in the 1940s and in the 1950s, those tools, machine translation tools, weren't easy to access at all. Like, it was very restricted to a limited number of people. And it was limited to translation experts. And then, a bit later, they became more widely used, but still, it was only used in some very restricted contexts. So I just wanted to quote two famous examples. So, for instance, in Canada, between 1977 and 2002, it was used to translate weather forecasts. And as you may know, weather in Canada is a very important issue. So there's a lot of funding that went into that project at the University of Montreal. It all started at the University of Montreal. So weather forecasts were translated automatically from English into French, and then they moved from also French into English. And the amount of words that was translated per year was 17 million. So 17 million words translated every year. Between 1977, that's when I was born, so it was a long time ago, and 2002. And then at DGT, it started in 1975. And so the first machine translation engine that was used at the European Commission was used in 1975. And so the DGT has been using machine translation since then. So again, ChatGPT is great, but it's not new. It's just another one, like another step, one step higher, okay? So I'm not going to go into much detail about all the system, just giving you the main features, I would say. So the early approach to machine translation was what we call rule-based. So rule-based machine translation, RBMT. And this prevailed from the 1950s to the 1990s. That's a long time. It was based on linguistic knowledge. So the idea was that the machine was trying to imitate the way humans process language, or the way we think that humans process language, because we're still investigating this. So these were based on a very large set of bilingual dictionaries, so vocabulary, basically, and on grammar rules. So there were lists of complex grammar rules. And so on the right-hand side, you have an extract of some of those grammar rules that were being used. And here on the left-hand side, you have a picture of a famous event that took place in the United States. You might have heard about it. It's the Georgetown demonstration. So it was the first example of the automatic translation of sentences. It worked between Russian and English. Again, you have to think about the context, right? 1950s. This was a wonderful machine which was able to translate 49 sentences, which dealt with 250 words, and which was based on 6 grammar rules. So, quite different from DeepL, Google Translate, and ChatGPT, but at the time, that was the best thing that they could do. But the thing is, they realized that it didn't work really well, so there were limitations. Well, first, because translation is not word-for-word substitution, as I just said, and also because translation involves much more than language. It involves real-world knowledge. It involves domain knowledge, understanding of concepts. Machines don't understand anything, right? When you're a human translator, you try to understand the text that you are translating. It also implies cultural sensitivity, and it also implies the context of communication. So, what are the main challenges? Well, as I said, the fact is that machines do not understand language. Machines do not have real-world knowledge or cultural sensitivity. And what machines do is that they just process language. So they spot patterns, they count frequencies, but they don't understand language. So in the 1990s, there was a new approach to machine translation, which was data-driven. And so now we're still in that phase, right? Data-driven. So the technological landscape in the 1990s was much different. There was better hardware, so it was cheaper, faster, smaller, more storage capacity. We used word processing, which means there was written text and there was data that we could use. And because the internet developed, then we could share and store all these data, and accessing the data was made easier. So there was a shift in paradigm to what computers can do really well. We stopped trying to imitate how humans process language. We thought, okay, they thought, what can machines do? Well, they can count, right? So what they can do really well is what Bowker calls pattern matching and number crunching. And that's why nowadays all the machine translation systems have nothing to do with language. So don't ever try to think that the engine you're using, did not understand that part, did not understand this sentence. The machine does not understand, and it's processing numbers. All of it is just numbers. It has nothing to do with language. So in this slide, I just summarize. It's a famous graph, not mine, but it summarizes the various steps of the development of machine translation. So, and the shift in paradigm, as I said here, in the 1990s. And so I don't think this graph has been updated. Maybe it has, but here you can see that the last one here is NMT, but what you have to add now is generative AI and LLMs. So these are the various phases through which machine translation went. Now, so I'm moving on to my last part. How do we train translators then in the age of AI? Well, one of the things that is really important, I think, has to do with dealing with misconceptions and perceptions. And that's also why I really insisted at the very beginning on opinions, perceptions, etc. So I thought it was interesting to have a look at what people specializing in education have to say in general. So I turned to two famous French philosophers, specialists of education. So one is Philippe Mérieux and the other one is Gaston Bachelard. So here is what Mérieux says, for instance, so it's been translated. Even before the teacher begins presenting a topic, the student already forms an idea about it. The child, upon entering the classroom, just like the adult entering a training session, already possesses a whole set of prior knowledge. Therefore, there is no chance of helping someone make progress unless we start from their existing representations. So I think it's always a good thing to start from the representations that students might have about translation and machine translation. What Gaston Bachelard says is that we come to know by opposing previous knowledge, by destroying poorly formed ideas. So the thing is, these representations are usually obstacles to acquiring new knowledge. So as instructors, I think our first job is to try and help the learner step away from their initial representation. And what are these representations? So, oops, just trying to move on to the next slide. Oh, yes, I know, sorry. So, usually what we can see when we talk to our students, our dear students, is that and especially students who want to become translators, there are two widespread misconceptions about machine translation. The first one is that machine translations and machine translation engines are considered as what I call oracles, right? So that's why I wrote, well, is DeepL or ChatGPT a modern-day Pythia, right? Because I keep hearing students telling me, oh, but I checked in DeepL, or I checked in Google Translate. If you check your translation in a machine translation engine, it means that you think the machine translation is right. And that's an issue. And it's not just students, it's for everyone. The other representation is that students also fear that their future job might be stolen by AI, right? So that's why I said that machine translation engines are sometimes seen as vampires, or to stay with the mythological metaphor, Strix. And you can see there have been studies about this, that there are negative perceptions among translators, but also negative perceptions among trainee translators. So they keep asking us, like, oh, but don't you think that the machine are going to replace us? Do you think we're on the right track? Do you think we should go on with this study? And so I think that shows that we really need to train them about machine translation. We have to explain how it works, where it comes from, what works well, what does not work well, and what their role should be. That's the main idea. So that also implies that we need to adapt and change our training programs. So there's been a number of studies about this, but there's now a growing number of courses dedicated to machine translation, pre-editing and post-editing in professional translator training programs, and especially in training programs in Europe that belong to the European Masters in Translation Network. So for instance, so that's one of the many skills, but for instance, the students really need to be able to sort through information, to assess its reliability. And this has always been the case, but now it's vital, essential, crucial. I don't know, but it's even more than what it was before. They must be able to use those tools effectively and to know which tool to use and when. And for instance, we've noticed that now, you might do that too, students tend to use machine translation tools as dictionaries. So they just put in a word whereas machine translation is not, so I can see that some people might be doing it. A machine translation tool is not a dictionary. If you want to use it, you want to translate a sentence. But if you just use one word, there's no context. Whereas a proper dictionary will show you all the contexts in which a word can be used, right? So that's why we really need to tell the students the difference between all those tools so that they can understand which tool to use at which moment. And that also shows that they have to have perfect knowledge of the languages involved. Grammar, vocabulary, subtle nuances, cultural backgrounds, etc. And just, I'm going to go very quickly here, but just to show you how the competence framework that we use in the EMT has evolved since 2009. So that was the first version, and so in that representation, you can see that technological competence was already there, 2009, okay? So it was already considered something important. But what it said is that students must understand the possibilities and limitations of machine translation. But that was already in 2009, but it wasn't very precise. Now, this competence framework was reviewed in 2017, and so there's a long list of competences, but among those competences, now you see that, again, technology is very important in that competence framework. But if you look at competence 16, the one at the bottom, it says, make use of search engines, corpus-based tools, and CAT tools, as well as computer-aided text analysis tools. And the next one has to do with machine translation. And this has been reviewed in 2022, just before the advent of generative AI. So there's still one thing missing. That will be probably the next one. But here, again, you see technology is right in the middle, so very important. And now you see that, for instance, competence 18 is about understanding the basics of machine translation systems, their impact on the translation process, and integrate machine translation into a translation workflow where appropriate. And that's what we're training our students to do. And also 19, recognize the importance and value of translation and language data. So really have to explain the importance of data. What do we need to teach? I'm almost done. We have to warn the students about the illusion of reality and about false fluency. Because the thing is, when you read the output of Google Translate or DeepL or ChatGPT, it sounds fluid. It's great. It looks great. It sounds great. And if you don't know the source language and you cannot see that something has been, that there's a, that something is wrong in the meaning or that the intention is different, it looks great and it looks easy, but it's very tricky. And it's trickier than before. It's much, because before, the mistakes were so gross that we kept laughing, ha ha ha, look, this has been translated by a machine. Now, it's not that obvious. Actually, it takes a real translator to see the difference. So they have to know, and for instance, ChatGPT, you really have the impression that you're having a real dialogue with someone. It's a machine. You just have to remember you're talking to a machine, you're not talking to a human being. So they have to know how to identify the mistakes, see what are the type of mistakes that the machine is likely to produce. And depending on the system, we know that some machines do well with some kind of errors and some problems, and some do less well. They have to be able to assess the quality of machine translation as far as readability, accuracy, etc. are concerned. There's lots of issues, for instance, about anaphora. So anaphora is when you talk about the same person or several times in the text, and machine translation really does not deal well with this. We saw examples yesterday in the text too, where in the translation we had the feeling that there were two different characters because they had been translated differently, even though it referred to the same person. So that's something that the machine really can't deal with. The handling of very complex adjectives is also something that the machine is still struggling with. And the students really have to know about the risks, and there are many risks, right? The ethics and the transparency, and they also have to learn that if they are using machine translation, for a client, they have to make sure, for instance, that the client agrees. They have to make sure that the client knows, these kind of things. And also the quality of the data. Because what we usually say, you know, when you train the engines, it really has an influence on the output. Garbage in, garbage out. That's, you know, what we use, the expression we use to sum this up. And now there's a new skill to be developed, which is prompt engineering. Because instead of telling, you know, the students, well, no, don't use, well, everybody's using it, and the industry now is using it. So instead of refusing to use it, well, why don't you become smart users of prompts? So we have to teach the students how to write a prompt for, you know, a number of cases. For instance, to integrate the purpose of the translation, or to integrate the target audience, or to help with terminological research and term definitions, or to help build relevant corpora, because now it's magical. You can just ask ChatGPT to build a corpus for you, but if you want to have the right corpus, you have to write the right request. So that's something that we really need to teach the students. To help count the words in a document, word counting is something which is very important. Well, you know, generative AI can do that very well, but then you have to teach the students how to do it. So I mentioned two papers that suggest new ideas for that. One which was produced at Carlisle University, for instance. And we also have to teach them how to assess the answers to the prompts. Because you get answers that look fluid, that look logical, except when you have hallucinations. But there are not that many hallucinations, actually. So it makes it even trickier. So again, you have to learn how to assess the answers. But to be able to do all of that, they first need to know all about the intricacies of translation. What translation implies, what the translation process is. If you don't know how to translate, you cannot post-edit. That's what I keep telling my students who want to do post-editing as soon as they're in the program. And I say, wait, first, you have to learn what translation is, and then once you know how to translate, then you can post-edit something that has been produced by the machine. So who else needs to be trained? The trainers. Trainers need to be trained. So we also have to keep up, and it's pretty hard, but we have to keep up. And so, for instance, we're organizing workshops within the DGT. We've been working on European projects too. Clients need to be better informed too about the risks and about the quality issues. Practitioners, translators need to learn from researchers, and I really insist on that too, because there are lots of things going on in research, and especially, you know, to show, for instance, that things are just perceptions, but that they do not correspond to reality. And also, researchers need to learn from practitioners. So the two are very important. And the last thing is the general public. The general public also has to understand how machine translation works, and this is a concept that has been developed by Lynn Bowker, which is called machine translation literacy. So, to conclude, this is my last slide. I'm going to quote from Lynn Bowker again, because as I said, she's the expert, more than me. But I thought, so she gave a presentation in February, and basically here's what she said, and I found it was very relevant. It's a very complex situation. So translation as a field is not well understood by people outside the field. There's a limited knowledge of what is involved. There are many misconceptions, as I tried to show, about the process and about the skills that are required. And as you know, maybe some of you are bilingual, whatever that means, and you might have been asked because you are bilingual to translate a document. But being bilingual doesn't make you a translator. And the challenge is that it's a task that looks easy, even though it's not easy. Machine translation is accessible everywhere, on apps, on the internet, it's everywhere. It's free in most cases. If you want to have access to DeepL Pro, which is useful in some cases, you have to pay for it, but otherwise it's just free. It's very convenient. We all use it, right? And it's very easy to use. For instance, through a camera on your phone, you're in a restaurant and you're looking at the menu and you want to know what's in the dish, and you can use that, right? So you have to assess the situations in which you can use it or not. You know, in which case it is risky, in which case it's not. What's at stake? So the conclusion is that machine translation needs to be used in a responsible way. And I'm done.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. So with that, we are looking for our first question.
Feel free to ask any question.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. I was wondering, as young students, specifically teenagers, are coming into college, a lot of times they feel very discouraged by the advancements in technology when they're going into fields like languages. Mm-hmm. How would you best address that kind of crisis of confidence? So again, I think that this probably has to do with maybe a limited knowledge of what all the language professions are. So I think that something that might be important is actually go, for instance, in high schools and explain, what these jobs are and what they actually consist in. Because once I think, especially for translation, once you've made it clear that translation is actually a very complex task, it can probably, boost their confidence. And if you tell them that they can become experts in that field in particular, then I think it might help. I think that's one of the things. But then, you have to understand what the job is, especially for translation. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you very much for this talk. Would you be able to elaborate a little more on some of the ethical concerns, particularly not just relying on kind of computer tools as the field has for a long time, but particularly with generative AI? Like, what ethical concerns arise from that?
Yeah. So the ethical, it has to do, I think there are probably two different things. But one, for instance, has to do with the confidentiality of the data. So I don't know if you're aware of the fact that, for instance, whenever you're using Google Translate or DeepL and that you're, using any kind of text in the machine, then it gets into the engine, Google engines, and you don't know what happens to the data. So that's why, for instance, if you use DeepL Pro, as I mentioned before, the difference between DeepL and DeepL Pro, one of the differences, is that for DeepL Pro, the data remains confidential, like it's not sent to DeepL. And that might be an issue for translators because, the data that you're translating, in some cases, can be really confidential. So confidentiality is one of them. Another one has to do with intellectual property. Who does the data belong to? And especially, as I said, I didn't go into much detail about machine learning, but when you talk about deep learning and machine learning, you have to feed data, right? You have to feed data, and you have to you also use previously translated texts. And one issue, I think that, something that wasn't such an issue before because the translators didn't really think about it, is actually wondering who the data belongs to. So for translation memories, imagine you've been translating in the field of economics for 10 years. You have produced translation.
And all those because we often think about it for literary texts, right? When we deal, with intellectual property, we always think about, books and novels and these kind of things. But when you translate, you're also an author. You produce text, right? And so the texts that you produce, that you translate, are being reused to feed machine translation engines. So that's another issue, and that's why people are even thinking about legislation about this. So that's probably the two main things that come to mind now.
Thank you again for your talk. I have a question about the field of translation right now for students, your students. I know that you work with the European Masters of Translation. You mentioned the need for translators at the European Union, for example. So I'm curious, what can you say about the number of students going into these programs today and the number of jobs waiting for them when they finish their degree?
Yeah, so we still have a rather high number of students applying. Just to let you know, so in my master's program, in the one I'm in charge of, there are 22, well, let me think. It was 22, okay? So there are only 22 students who can enter the program. And we restricted to that small number because we want all the students that do the Masters in Translation to get a job once they graduate. So last year we had 390 applicants. And this year, for our program, it did go down a little bit. So I think we only have like 350. But for instance, we've just had the numbers for this year. But I've talked with a colleague in Dijon who said that it was still the same number as last year. But what we also tend to do, is something that I forgot to mention, is that we really tend to help the students diversify their activities. So we train them to do subtitling, to do like proper translation, post-editing, what we also call transcreation. So that's what you do, for instance, for advertising, because that relies on creativity. Copywriting, SEO, so now what we think is that they should be able to do a large number of things. And we also train them. So before, in my program, we used to have like two different paths for people who wanted to become translators and those who wanted to become interpreters. So we don't train like conference interpreters, but there are other kinds of interpreting, and now that's for everyone. And so the students that have recently graduated, they do a bit of everything. So yeah, they do like, and I can see that on LinkedIn, for instance, because I can see their posts, and I see that like one day, today I'm subtitling, I don't know, a documentary movie, blah, blah, blah. And then the next day, I've been translating for a commission on, the rights of I don't know what. And then the next day, I'm on an interpreting mission today, and I'm going to translate for refugees in a different context. And I think that's something that is, and that's also why at the very beginning, very beginning, I said that we need to train highly skilled and adaptable translators. So adaptability, flexibility is also a quality that is essential for translators, future translators.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. I've just been thinking about what you've been saying within the context of, I work at the Writing Center here tutoring French, and I'm obviously not fluent in French. I do the best that I possibly can, but I've realized that I think a lot of the students who are currently learning the language see these generative AI tools as like objectively correct in the right way of doing things, whereas like in the translation seminar that I'm in, we've talked about like how there's so many different ways of translating, being loyal to the text, being creative, changing yourself. And I'm wondering specifically, considering the fact that we're talking about these machines as like following algorithms and like data, but also the fact that they are created by real humans who have biases and subjectivity, how that could kind of like play out politically in the way that generative AI translates things, and if you see any danger there.
All right. Rather complex question. But yeah, actually it's interesting to see where human beings stand in the process, because human beings still play a part at some point, but I do think we still have a role as human beings to be able to assess, the degree of creativity, for instance. Because when I was preparing this lecture, and I've been playing with ChatGPT much more than what I had been doing before. And whenever I, asked ChatGPT to translate or blah, 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 I always added something at the beginning. Oh, do you want me to do it like more literary, more blah, 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 more creative? And for instance, I tried something fun. I took an extract of Fox and Socks by Dr. Seuss, and I used it through different machine translation engines, and I used ChatGPT, and the first translation was interesting. Because we know creativity, if you talk about Dr. Seuss, obviously there's a lot of creativity there. And the first result was interesting, but still there was something missing. And so because ChatGPT asked, okay, do you want me to do this? Blah, blah, blah. I said, okay, yes, do it. And I looked at 3 different versions, and I found that none of them was entirely satisfactory. And using them as a starting point to use your own creativity, I think, is probably the best answer. But to do that, again, you have to know about the language. That's really why you have to learn about, languages. If you want to play with words, because that's what it is about in Dr. Seuss, you have to have vocabulary. You have to have vocabulary, and even to be able to assess the creation, the neological creations that are produced by the machine, you have to know, oh yes, that rings a bell, that reminds me of another word and another word, but it means that you already have to have your own, to have real knowledge of the language. So not sure I'm really answering your question. Yes? Okay. But again, I think it's yet another tool. It's yet another tool. But then you have to have a very sharp mind to be able to use it correctly.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. Even though I am a bilingual speaker of English and German, and quite a bit of French too, so trilingual, but I have always been in awe of the people who worked at the UN as simultaneous translators. It would be something I could never do, because for me, like, the languages are on different tracks actually, and to connect between the tracks is actually quite difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, so it's true, I mostly focused on translation and written translation. I didn't say much about interpreting. That would be another another topic. But it is true that interpreting requires even more specific skills, and especially if you do simultaneous translation. It is a very, very demanding task. So knowledge of languages has to be almost perfect, I would say. Your knowledge of the cultures has to be very good too, and general knowledge. And the thing is, you have to do that like on the spot. You don't have time to do research or anything. And you also have another dimension that might not be as obvious in written documents, which has to do with all the, I'm not sure what the term is in English, but like extra linguistic or paraverbal like behavior, like, because you're interpreting somebody and the way the speaker is saying something, you can say that, oh, he's being ironical about it, or he's hesitating, which means that you also have to, hesitate. You have to reproduce the tone. You have to reproduce the or there could be someone saying something and then like winking at the same time. And that the person is actually, what he means is just the opposite. And as an interpreter, this is something that you also have to convey. And so that's why it makes it even harder, I think, for machines to be able to interpret correctly. And because there are attempts, we've seen a number of things. I think there's even a function on Zoom, actually, where you can have like highly developed, But again, it very much depends on the context. If you just want to know is like what the thing is about, it's like general, you want to get the gist of what is being said, maybe that can be enough. If you're at the UN and a war might be involved or at stake, well then you want to have the various subtleties and everything translated. And that's the same for machine translation. You really have to assess the risks. So.
I was wondering what you think of the role of the usage of AI specifically in language learning platforms and how that might affect the learning process of people outside of academia.
Language learning platforms? Yeah?
Like Duolingo, for example, has recently started using AI as a feature to practice learning languages. So I was wondering what you think of that and how that affects how people learn.
Not too much into language learning, so I'm not sure I would have a very precise opinion about this. But yeah, again, I would say that as a language learner, the main thing is you cannot trust the machine entirely. It's the same thing. When I talked about machine translation engines being like oracles, I would say it's the same for those type of platforms. So I don't know how exactly it is used on those platforms, but the thing is, like, don't be blind, right? Don't be blind and try to think in a critical manner about the results that are produced by AI. Yeah.
This concludes tonight's program. Please join me in thanking our guest.